Nikolas Kompridis is a Canadian philosopher and political theorist. His major published work addresses the direction and orientation of Frankfurt School critical theory, the legacy of philosophical Romanticism, and the aesthetic dimension of politics. His writing touches on a variety of issues in social and political thought, aesthetics, and the philosophy of culture, often in terms of reworked concepts of receptivity and world disclosure, a paradigm he calls reflective disclosure. He is currently a research professor and director of the Institute for Social Justice at the Australian Catholic University. Critical theory. After gaining his Ph.D. at Toronto's York University, Kompridis worked with the influential philosopher and Frankfurt School social theorist Jürgen Habermas while a postdoctoral fellow at Goethe University. Following his time with Habermas, he wrote a book responding to what he saw as serious shortcomings and inconsistencies in his mentor's work. In Critique and Disclosure, Critical Theory Between Past and Future, Kompridis argues that Habermasian critical theory, which has in recent decades become the main paradigm of that tradition, has largely severed its own roots in German idealism, while neglecting modernity's distinctive relationship to time and the utopian potential of critique. While drawing on many of Habermas' own insights, Kompridis proposes an alternative approach to social criticism and what he sees as its role in facilitating social change. This interpretation is guided by an engagement with Martin Heidegger's concept of world disclosure, as well as alternative conceptions of key philosophical categories, like critique, agency, reason, and normativity. Arguing against Habermas' procedural conception of reason and in favor of a new paradigm Kompridis calls reflective disclosure. The book suggests that critical theory should become a possibility-disclosing practice of social criticism, if it is to have a future worthy of its past. Critical reception and engagement. In a largely favorable review of the book, Fred R. Dalmare writes, "This is an important and timely book, both in philosophical and in practical political terms. Today its plea for a recovery of trust in the future has gained unexpectedly broad resonance. The book in a way signals the end of a period marked by divergent, even opposite tendencies. On the one hand, the postmodern fascination with extraordinary rupture, and on the other, the streamlining of critical theory in the mold of a rule-governed, rationalist normalcy." James Swindle suggests that Kompridis has not taken more recent work of Habermas fully into account, but that nonetheless, this is a book that needed to be written, because Habermas's critique of disclosure was at times narrow and short-sighted. But as Habermas is now rethinking some of these shortcomings, Kompridis gives him, and indeed all critical theorists, ample resources for a better balance between disclosure and procedural thinking. Similarly, Dana Villa writes that, Kompridis argues, persuasively, "I think that contemporary critical theory would do well to abandon its insistence that communicative rationality is the quasi-transcendental core of democratic legitimacy, and rethink its suspicion of world disclosure." In November 2011, the journal Philosophy and Social Criticism published a number of responses to the book from other critical theorists, along with a reply from Kompridis. Kompridis has also published a number of essays arguing for his own conceptions of cultural change, receptivity, critique, recognition and reason, and has engaged in written debates about these and other issues with critical theorists including Amy Allen, Axel Honneth, Nancy Fraser and Salah Ben Habib. Romanticism. Kompridis has written that he sees critical theory, and critique in general, as implicitly romantic in its self-understanding, and much of his scholarly work reflects this concern. His edited collection, Philosophical Romanticism, includes essays on diverse themes in Romanticism from philosophers such as Albert Borgman, Stanley Cavell, Hubert Dreyfus, Richard Eldridge, Robert Pippin and others, as well as his own contributions. The topics addressed in the volume include beginning anew, self-determination in expression, art and irony, the living force of things, and returning the everyday. In 2009, Kompridis published a chapter on Romanticism in the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy and Literature, articulating his view of the relationship between Romanticism and social change, and particularly the work of the social critic. There, he connects the work of a number of poets, artists and philosophers, including Rainer Maria Rilke, Walter Benjamin, Jean-Luc Godard, William Wordsworth and Ralph Waldo Emerson, whom Kompridis sees sharing a deep concern with the possibility of individual and cooperative transformation. He writes that what is demanded of the Romantic critic, in spite of all the obstacles and constraints, in spite of the improbability and possible futility of it all, is to find and found new ways of looking at things, new ways of speaking and acting, new kinds of practices, and new kinds of institutions. Anyone who thinks such change is not only necessary but also possible, whatever their view of Romanticism, is a hopeless romantic. Politics, aesthetics and receptivity. The Aesthetic Turn in Political Thought is a collection of essays, edited by Kompridis, which explores the connections between aesthetics and democratic politics. The book takes as its starting point a statement by Jacques Rancière, that politics is aesthetic in principle, a musician by training. Kompridis has frequently married an interest in aesthetics with other philosophical concerns. Among others, he has authored papers on topics including the philosophy of music under conditions of cultural pluralism, on the relation between receptivity, recognition, and literature, and on the priority of receptivity to creativity, a paper that explores Russell Hoban's novel, The Medusa Frequency. Kompridis has lectured on film, on the relationship between cultural memory, diversity, and the arts, and has discussed music and philosophy with his former teacher, the composer Martin Bresnik, in a discussion broadcast on ABC's Big Ideas program. In 2011, Kompridis guest-edited and contributed to a special issue of the journal Ethics and Global Politics on A Politics of Receptivity, Technology and Human Being. In 2008, Kompridis spoke at a conference on the post-human condition, held in Auckland. In the talk, Kompridis outlined the potential dangers he saw from the new, convergent technosciences of genetic engineering, synthetic biology, robotics and nanotechnology, while criticizing what he considered to be the transhumanist aspirations of several major research programs in those fields. According to Kompridis, the post-human is now a real, not a notional, possibility, and therefore the question of what it means to be human is all of a sudden a pressing question. A question absolutely pressed for time, since, evidently, the space in which it can still be meaningfully posed, and thus the space in which a meaningful response could be fashioned, is shrinking at an alarming rate, while acknowledging that in a culturally plural world, there can be no single or essentialist conception of what it means to be human. Kompridis nonetheless argues that we have an obligation to deepen our understanding of what it is that is actually threatened by the new technologies. Otherwise, the question of what it means to be human will be permanently foreclosed for human beings, because it will have been already decided by scientific experts and market forces, and a certain tendency of our liberal culture to favor anything that increases the freedom of choice of individuals. Kompridis therefore proposes an interdisciplinary counter-science of the human, to provide alternatives to naturalistic assumptions about identity, which predominate in the natural sciences, and which work in concert with the wider culture of individualism to erode, and preclude, other understandings of what it means to be human. This counter-science would take as its two main starting points the concept of the person, underpinned not by consciousness, but by a definition based on the things that human beings care about in peculiarly human ways, and the phenomenon of intercorporeality, the way in which human beings develop the ability to learn, act and make sense of things under conditions of embodiment in a social context. This approach is intended to complement and build upon the work of other philosophers, including Harry Frankfurt, Charles Taylor and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Exchange with Sailor Ben Habib. In 2006, Kompridis participated in an exchange with critical theorist Sailor Ben Habib in the journal Political Theory. Kompridis criticized Ben Habib's book The Claims of Culture, arguing that she promotes a deeply problematic concept of hybridity. In his view, this commits her to applying a double standard with respect to endangered or marginal cultural traditions in larger societies, leaving minority cultures at a disadvantage and vulnerable to assimilation. Ben Habib denied this, writing that cultures which are subject to decentering, reflexivity, and pluralization can regenerate from within themselves novel semantic resources of resistance to assimilation. In a response published in the same issue of Political Theory as Ben Habib's reply, Kompridis writes that this demands too little of modern democracies, and puts too great a burden on minority cultures. How curious that Ben Habib can be firmly opposed to freezing cultural differences, yet firmly in favor of freezing constitutional principles. It seems that hybridity is very much welcome if it is confined to the domain of culture, but complex cultural dialogue should not be so defensive. It should not asymmetrically distribute the risk of decentering, reflexivity, and openness to change, either between minorities and majorities or between democratic politics and constitutional principles. To counter Ben Habib's argument for cultural hybridity, Kompridis suggests starting instead with the view that cultures are both identical and non-identical with themselves. Had Ben Habib started from this position, he suggests, she could have approached questions of cultural preservation very differently, and more open-mindedly. The problem of cultural preservation doesn't have to be presented as demanding the right to freeze existing cultural differences. It can be presented instead as a matter of fairly and sensitively enabling the free interplay between what is identical and non-identical in a culture with itself. Books, Critique and Disclosure. Critical Theory Between Past and Future. 2006. Cambridge. MIT Press. 337 pp. Philosophical Romanticism 2006. London. Routledge. 304 pp. The Aesthetic Turn in Political Thought 2014. New York, London. Bloomsbury. 320 pp.